Hey folks, Sam Seder here. You're listening to a free version of the Ring of Fire radio podcast. If you want the total show without commercials, head over to rofpodcast.com and become a member of this program. Look, this is our main source of revenue for Ring of Fire radio, and you can help keep us on the air by signing up for a Ring of Fire podcast membership. For far less than a cup of coffee a week, you can support this program and get our full show. Head over to rofpodcast.com right now and sign up. Much appreciated. Hey, this is Sam Seder. You're listening to the best of Ring of Fire Radio. Welcome back to Ring of Fire Radio. I'm Sam Seder. Hey, if you missed the first hour of our show, just head over to rofpodcast.com and become a member of this podcast. It's the best way to support this program. Joining us this hour, independent journalist David Dayen. He writes at The Nation magazine. He writes at The Intercept. He writes at, just about every place online. And, of course, is the author of Chain of Title, How Three Ordinary Americans Uncovered Wall Street's Great Foreclosure Fraud. David, thanks so much for joining me on Ring of Fire Radio. You have a couple of pieces out this week, a typical week for you, very busy. But there was a couple of things that Donald Trump addressed this week that were, just for show. And then, of course, there was the Muslim ban. We'll talk about that in a bit. But let's just start briefly about this 2-for-1 regulation executive order that he promulgated, which to me just sounds like a fairly empty pitch. But then I also want to talk about that piece you wrote about the big threat that Donald Trump is ignoring. Let's start first with that executive order proclamation, where supposedly we've got to get rid of 2 regulations for every new one, which has to be, just on its face, one of the dumbest ideas I've ever heard offered in American politics.
Yeah, I'm not going to argue with that. First of all, there's this sort of metaphysical question of what is a regulation, right? I mean, what is one regulation and what is 2 regulations? You can have a regulation that covers 30 different facets of a particular issue area, and you can have a regulation that covers a small piece of an issue area. It's just the idea that regulations are standalone units like blocks, and you can put one in and take 2 away is kind of silly. But if you read the actual executive order, it doesn't say that you have to remove 2 regulations for every one that you put forward. It says you have to identify 2 regulations for removal for every one that you put forward. And the real issue here, and we've seen this repeatedly, this is a part of the Republican playbook, it's just to make it harder to issue a regulation. So we have these various procedures. You have to do public comment. You have to respond to every public comment. You have to comply with other certain things in the statute. In order to get a regulation done, you have to send it to the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. You have to get it approved. There's a million pieces of red tape with getting a regulation finalized, and this just adds some more. And so the chilling effect that is attempting to be created with this executive order is just to make it nearly impossible to promulgate a rule out of any regulatory agency. And of course, what Donald Trump has said is that if you come to me with a regulation, he even said this on the day that he signed the order, if you come to me with a regulation, I'm probably not going to allow it, and because it's already been probably offered 17 times before. So the idea that there's going to be 2 regulations taken away for every one that's put in, he's telling you that none are going to be put in So none are consequently going to be taken away under this process. It's kind of governing by bumper sticker without any kind of force of reality behind it.
It reminded me of, following the Affordable Care Act, one of the big things that Republicans were pushing was this notion that no bill should be over 10 pages long.
Right.
Just sort of like a random number of, forget about bills that are complicated. Let's just pretend we live in a small village with 35 people. I mean, fortunately, it was largely ignored because of all the other insanity that was going on this past week. And we should also add, one of the only other time regulations came up this week was the idea that Donald Trump, in meeting with pharmaceutical executives, we had known for a long time, he claimed, we're going to negotiate to get lower prices because we're such a big buyer. And he basically caved, met with pharmaceutical executives and said, all I'm going to do is lower your taxes and deregulate you. And then I guess the idea is pharmaceutical companies are going to then pass on the savings. Is that the idea?
That's right. And that's a great point. And it just shows that when you get down to it, there are no ideas coming from this president or this administration or this political party other than the typical conservative bromides of tax cuts, regulation, and trickle down. There's really nothing else there. When push comes to shove, they're not going to take on special interests like the pharmaceutical lobby and do things, common sense things like allow a bulk purchaser to negotiate drug prices. That's not part of the agenda. And Trump really, I think that's going to be an important political issue down the road. The fact that it took all of 10 days for him to go from we're going to do competitive bidding to, oh, no, what we're going to really do is cut regulations and cut your taxes. And you see it in the fact that the pharmaceutical stocks after that meeting jumped in price because they know now we're not going to have to sacrifice anything. We're just going to get all the benefits showered upon us, and we're not even going to really have to pass on those savings to the customer.
I'm sure they will out of the goodness of their heart, David. You're being very cynical. All right, we got to take a break. When we come back, let's talk about that big threat that Donald Trump is ignoring and the big threat that Donald Trump is making up. We got to take a quick break. Sam Seder, Ring of Fire Radio. I'm talking to David Dayen. We'll be right back after this.
The club isn't the best place to find a lover, so the bar is where I go. Me and my friends sat at the table doing shots, tripping fast, and then we talk slow. And you come over and start up a conversation with just me, and trust me, I'll give it a chance. Now take my hand, stop it, and the man on the jukebox, and then we start to dance. And now I'm singing like, girl, you know I want your love. Your love was handmade for somebody like me. Coming now.
I'm a trial lawyer. I've spent countless hours pouring through documents that tell the story about the ugliest side of corporate America.
Fraud.
Corporate media refuses to talk about these issues.
The conduct by this company was deplorable.
I'm going to paint a clear picture about how disturbing, how corrupt corporate conduct has become in modern America. These are stories that no one else can tell. I'm Mike Papantonio, host of America's Lawyer. Question more.
Sam Seder here. You're listening to the best of Ring of Fire Radio. We're back. Sam Seder, Ring of Fire Radio. I'm talking to the great David Dayen, journalist, author of Chain of Title, How Three Ordinary Americans Uncovered Wall Street's Foreclosure Fraud. A fantastic book, available everywhere, still being cited. And in fact, David Dayen's piece on Steve Mnuchin's lying, I think, certainly delayed his confirmation. And you can protest, David, but that's the way I see it. And but before I let you even protest, let's talk about two things that happened this week. Donald Trump ignoring a major threat to America, and then making up a major threat to America. Let's start with the one he's ignoring, we saw this week. This seems to be happening on a weekly basis where airlines are ground to a halt.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was just amusing to me that on this day after Donald Trump announces a travel ban, the same day Delta Airlines announces their own travel ban because their systems went down. This is the second major outage for them since August. It was the second major airline outage in a week. United had a similar glitch. Hundreds of flights were canceled, thousands more delayed. And this, your suspicion is correct. Indeed, there have been more of these airline delays and computer system malfunctions in the era of consolidation of the airlines, because the way it works is that you're essentially putting legacy systems created in the 90s on top of one another and hoping they interface, hoping that, in the case of United, that the Continental Airlines and the America West Airlines or all the other airline systems from the past somehow merge together and work seamlessly. And what we see is that the investments aren't made to make them work seamlessly. Now, what's funny is that all these mergers get sold on the basis of efficiencies that will be created by merging, in, among other things, these IT systems. But what it actually creates is these massive delays and cancellations and malfunctions, which, of course, because there are less airlines, ripple across the system in a much more disruptive fashion. And, if we want to talk about making America secure or giving America the ability to be productive, I would say that making sure that their airlines don't break down because they're just creaky it might be a better use of the abilities of the office.
And this is one of the sort of the issues that I think is not going to get the attention that I think guys like you and I had hoped in terms of things like antitrust and monopoly powers. But even on the most on the loosest framework that is used in determining whether or not a merger is helpful for our economy, right? I mean, we migrated at one point in the 80s where mergers were the legitimacy or the preferability, I guess, if you will, of mergers soon became a function of would consumers get a lower price? Would it create those efficiencies rather than whether or not it would create a problem throughout our society? Even that lower bar is not being met when you start to see these massive shutdowns because they're not making efficiencies. They're actually sort of creating massive inefficiencies.
That's correct. And also, I mean, just on the raw level of price, I mean, what are we seeing happening in the airline industry? There are thinner flights. Most flights take off full. Getting that last ticket becomes pricier. And what are they doing with all the add-ons? There's, all of a sudden it costs you money to put stuff in the overhead compartment, or it costs you money to get a pillow or something. I mean, when you have no other choice for your options of travel, you're going to have to put up with these kinds of, frankly, abuses in terms of pricing and in terms of quality. I mean, it's not like individuals who are flying Delta Airlines on Sunday could really, as particularly in places where there are hubs, and there are practically no other flights, at least convenient flights, that fly out of those cities. The consumer has no choice. The consumer has no option other than to deal with a poorly constructed system. And that is sort of the essence of monopoly power.
And this, of course, ripples throughout the economy and just sort of the people's quality of life. But I want to touch this on you and get your thoughts. Donald Trump, over the last weekend, issued what amounted to a ban on immigration and refugees from 7 countries, predominantly Muslim countries. The administration had to walk back some things. There were moments where we saw court orders that were being, I don't want to say ignored, but pretty close to ignored by some officials on the ground. Raised a lot of different issues. What was the one thing that stood out from you in that drama and obviously the ongoing drama?
Yeah. Well, I happened to be at LAX on that Saturday when the protests were first germinating. I was actually flying in, and I stuck around to talk to some people. And this individual that I was able to speak with, his name is Mohammed Al-Rawi. He was a translator for the Los Angeles Times Baghdad Bureau. He was, like most Iraqis who worked with the U.S., whether it was the military or the press, he was targeted, in this case by al-Qaeda in Iraq forces. His house was ransacked. His belongings were set on fire. He lived in the LA Times offices for 3 years before finally getting qualified to leave the country. And he came to America, he told me, with his wife, 2 kids, and 2 suitcases, and that was it, several years ago in 2010. Now, his father was coming to see his grandkids for the first time in years and was pulled off a plane in Qatar the day that this announcement of the executive order was made and told to go back to Baghdad. And essentially, now this man's cut off from this individual and his family. And he said to me, if I had one thing that I could say to Donald Trump, it would be that I am a victim of terrorism. That, the majority of people who are victimized by terrorism are Muslims. And he said, I would be in support of something that makes us safe, but this is just an arbitrary designation that is separating families, ripping apart families, and hurting the very people who are the victims that it's supposed to protect.
Right. I mean, unless it's really supposed to be a way to signal to Donald Trump's fans and followers and voters, hey, I'm going to exclude Muslim people from this country.
And a way to signal to Muslims that they better just keep out of the country because this is just the beginning and we don't know what's coming next. I mean, I think that's the real impact of this, is just to keep Muslim Americans from America, to keep not just refugees, but foreign nationals who want to settle here, whether it's because they want to take advantage of America's colleges and universities and science programs or whatever. It's just to stem that flow. And
I think
it's really a truly nationalist viewpoint.
Yeah, and intimidate Muslims in this country. Well, David Dayen, can you stick with me through the break? I want to talk to you about some of these stories coming about the Democrats finding a spine. David Dayen will be back with us in just a moment. I'm Sam Seder. You're listening to Ring of Fire Radio.
Even if it makes me blind, I just want to see the light. Breathe in, leave it all behind. I just want to see the light. Even if it makes me blind, I just want to see the light. Breathe in, leave it all behind. I just want to see the light.
Folks, the Ring of Fire is sponsored by JustCoffee.coop. That's JustCoffee.coop. If you like fair trade, delicious coffee, tea, or chocolate, head over to JustCoffee.coop. Use the coupon code MAJORITY and get 10% off. There's free shipping. You have no reason not to get this great coffee. It's a great outfit in Madison, Wisconsin, which supported the protests there. JustCoffee.coop. You're listening to the best of Ring of Fire Radio. My name is Sam Seder. We'll be back with a new show next week. We are back, Sam Seder on Ring of Fire Radio. On the phone with me, David Dayen, writes at The Intercept, The Nation magazine, just about anywhere on the internet. And David, some I don't know if you want to accept any congratulations, but I got to say, there's no one in the country who has written more about foreclosure fraud and the problems that we had, particularly in the mortgage industry on the servicing side. And in fact, you wrote the book on it. But Steve Mnuchin, don't know how long it's going to last, and I want your opinion on it, but Steve Mnuchin will not or did not get a vote this week because Democrats found their spine and refused to provide a quorum for the committee. The Financial Services Committee refused to hold a vote which would confirm Steve Mnuchin, or at least send him into the full Senate for a full confirmation. Explain to us why. How did this happen?
Yeah, so it was actually two members of Trump's proposed cabinet, Steve Mnuchin and Tom Price, who is looking to be the Health and Human Services Secretary. And the Finance Committee Democrats did not show up for the vote because both of these individuals lied in testimony to the committee. It's really as simple as that. This is not a situation where it was, they had a difference of opinion or some concerns about ideological matters. These two guys lied to the committee. And, there's a pretty long-standing practice that if you do that, you're going to get in some trouble. And Republicans clearly were willing to overlook that. They were going to hold the votes on Tuesday morning. And Democrats said, hold everything. We have definitive evidence of these lies. Now, we can talk about what those lies were. Yep. In the case of Mnuchin, he claimed in questions, written questions submitted for the record, that One West Bank, where he was CEO from 2009 to 2015, did not engage in this thing called robo-signing. And robo-signing refers to essentially mass perjury. It's when individual employees of the bank sign these affidavits or other foreclosure documents that attest to having done a thorough review of all the underlying loan information in a particular foreclosure case, while not actually engaging in that review. And in the case of One West Bank, this is truly obvious. I mean, an employee of One West Bank, Erica Johnson-Seck, admitted to robo-signing in a 2009 deposition. She said, I sign 750 of these affidavits a week, and I don't read them, and I don't check the information for whether or not it's accurate. I don't know who inputted it. There's a 10% random sample review done by somebody else, and I don't even sign these in front of a notary. And she admitted all this in a courtroom deposition, and this was well after Steve Mnuchin put together One West Bank and, months after the company started up. Later, the Columbus Dispatch put out a story on Sunday on the 29th saying that they went into the Ohio Public Records and found these robo-signed documents from Erica Johnson-Seck and other members of her team who signed thousands of these things without actually scrutinizing the underlying information. So this is just an obvious lie. And when Mnuchin was given an opportunity to correct it, he did not. He relied on a discredited report by the called the Independent Foreclosure Review, a regulatory review of foreclosures, that does not say anything about robo-signing, and he claimed that review exonerates him and his bank from the fact that they robo-signed. It's garbage, and so that is the reason for Mnuchin why they decided to use this fairly extraordinary step to deny a quorum within the committee.
Did One West ever have to do an internal review? Did they ever have any type of formal accounting for that robo-signing? I mean, it came up in this one case in 2009, at least in terms of testimony from an individual at One West. But did One West, as an entity, ever have to have any formal accountability for this?
Right. So there was this review called the Independent Foreclosure Review, which was put together by the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency and the Federal Reserve. It came out of the consent order that One West signed that said they were engaging in robo-signing, among other things, which they agreed to and signed. They didn't admit or deny the behavior within that document, but they signed the document, and those were the findings. This review, I don't want to call it the Independent Foreclosure Review because it was not independent. The One West and the other banks that had to engage in this handpicked the reviewers. They leaned on the reviewers. They got to design the review themselves. There is copious evidence from whistleblowers who were reviewers that the banks deliberately minimized borrower harm, that they altered the criteria by which these reviews could take place to basically use them as a get-out-of-jail-free card. One West completed this review, and now this flawed thing that the regulators really did not track in any meaningful way. This is an example of the terrible accountability that we had during the Obama era around the foreclosure crisis. Now it's being used to prop up Steve Mnuchin's lies to the committee.
All right, let's. I want to talk briefly Tom Price's lies, which not only did he seem to me to lie to the committee, but there seems to be some underlying criminal activity there too that one would hope would have some accountability. Who knows if it will? Tell us about Tom Price.
So Tom Price is a congressman, and he has been accused from numerous reports of engaging in a series of stock trading, particularly around stocks in medical device companies or drug companies. The particular lie at issue here is that he got a sweetheart deal with an Australian medical company called Innate Immunotherapeutics, where he was able to get a discounted private option to purchase these shares of stock. And what he claimed in the committee hearing is that, well, everybody had the opportunity to access this special deal. And it's not true. In fact, only 20 U.S. investors were able to get it. And he knew about this stock because of an invite from his fellow Republican, Chris Collins, who sits on the board of Innate Immunotherapeutics. So this was a clear discrepancy in the testimony. And as a result, Democrats on the committee want to get that straightened out and understand where the truth lies, and that's why they boycotted.
All right, we got to take a break. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about Tom Price, because on top of that, the guy also claimed and was contradicted by the Trump administration that he had no idea what stocks he was buying through a financial advisor. It just so happened that of all the stocks in the world, it was one which just a week later he would introduce legislation that would directly help that one company. Thank goodness for such coincidences. But we got to take a quick break. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. On the phone, I'm talking to David Dayen. He's the author of Chain of Title, How 3 Ordinary Americans Uncovered Wall Street's Great Foreclosure Fraud. We'll be right back. You're listening to the best of Ring of Fire Radio. I'm Sam Seder, and we'll be back with a new show next week. We're back, Sam Seder, Ring of Fire Radio. On the phone, David Dayen. He's the author of Chain of Title, How 3 Ordinary Americans Uncovered Wall Street's Great Foreclosure Fraud. We are talking about the Finance Committee, or I should say the Democrats on the Finance Committee, who refused to provide a quorum this week to vote on two of Donald Trump's nominees, Steve Mnuchin for Treasury Secretary and Congressman Tom Price for Secretary of Health and Human Services. He would be in charge of cutting your Medicare and your Social Security and your Affordable Care Act. The vote did not go forward on both those guys because, according to Sherrod Brown, he wanted both of them to come back to the committee, explain why they outright lied to the committee. They each had different respective lies, and then maybe work it from there, which, of course, I don't know if that's going to happen. Before we get to your sense, David, of whether or not this vote's actually going to go forward, I want to just stop on Tom Price. The lie that he talked about was whether or not he had an opportunity to get favored shares that were not available to the public. That seems to be pretty cut and dried. There's also this extant issue of him claiming that his broker had bought stock, unbeknownst to Tom Price, in a company that Tom Price then just coincidentally, within 2 weeks, introduced legislation that was almost for the benefit of exclusively that one company. Maybe in one other company helped too. But that to me both seems hard to believe and arguably criminal.
Yeah, and there's a similar issue with this innate immunotherapeutics, where he was instrumental in the 21st Century CARES Act, which actually passed Congress last December, which will enable Innate to speed up the approval process on one of their multiple sclerosis drugs. So there does seem to be this history with Price of trading in these stocks and then using his power as a congressman to try to benefit personally the ability for these particular companies to succeed.
So what do you think are the chances that the Democrats will do this? I mean, like literally, is there no way to fill these vacancies if the Democrats refuse to show up at the committee hearings?
I'm not sure that there's no way. There are a number of things that Republicans could do. Number one, they could simply change that rule that you need a quorum at these committee hearings in order to conduct business. And indeed, Orrin Hatch, the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, kind of made a veiled threat about that today. So that's a possibility. The other one is that they could advance these nominations directly to the floor without a committee recommendation. We've seen that John Bolton got to the floor that way, actually, back in the Bush administration. And you know, the third thing is that as we see with these boycotts and holdouts, I mean, you kind of can only take them so long, whether you're talking about Wisconsin or Indiana back when these labor protests went forward. It becomes more difficult as the days go on. But I think the Democrats made a strong point that you can't just have these nominees come in and lie to the committee and get away with it. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like Republicans are really care about that particular consequence.
Now, so this week we saw Betsy DeVos get out of the committee process on a party line vote, 12-11. And this is even after of the revelation that she plagiarized one of her responses to the committee's questions from an Obama official. It doesn't seem to me, David, that there's going to be any rejection of any of Trump's nominees. I mean,
well,
by
maybe
Republicans.
I would say that the only possible rejection, this would probably be through a withdrawal, is of Andy Puzder, the nominee for Labor Secretary, whose confirmation hearing has now been delayed 4 times. It was supposed to be next week. That has pushed back. He cannot get the forms filled out in terms of the Office of Government Ethics and the financial disclosures. He's had several weeks to fill out these forms. They still haven't been filled out and turned in. There was a story in Politico where he claimed to be tired of the process and all these questions. And of course, Andy Puzder is the guy whose wife appeared in disguise on Oprah talking about the history that she had with domestic violence with her spouse. And then today it came out that his mentor was this lawyer who worked for the mob. So it just seems like there are a lot of reasons why Andy Puzder just might not make it to the finish line.
So we may not have him to kick around anymore. That just means that there's a slight delay in the Trump's administration's plan to totally destroy any type of labor regulations across the country. So I guess thank goodness for a little favors, and of course this week we found out who the Republican, or the nominee, I should say, to the Supreme Court. So things are going to move forward. But how much obstruction? I mean, how encouraging is? I mean, and of course, you had the Democrats not going in and sort of slowing up the process because of a process issue, right? Lying to the committee is a process issue, rather than saying we're not going to accept the legitimacy of any of these picks, or we just find these people to be so outside the mainstream. Give me your sense on that. Like how much spine is there on the Democratic side?
I think Democrats in the Senate are struggling to catch up with the desires of their constituents. The constituents very clearly want a blanket resistance using any trick that they have and some that they don't have to stop whatever it is Trump wants from happening. I was surprised in writing this story about how these nominees were stalled. People were angry. They said, "Why stall? Why can't they block them?" And my wonder is, what is the mechanism for that in a Senate that is controlled by Republicans? But that is the clear message coming out of the rank and file. And Senate Democrats who have voted for certain nominees, who have allowed certain things to happen, maybe without the level of resistance, without requiring unanimous consent or things like that, they are being criticized pretty heavily from their constituents. And so, whether or not the idea that you're going to block everything when Republicans have total control of government is realistic or not, that is at some level the expectation.
And at the very least,
Senate Democrats are going to have to figure that one out.
Yeah, at the very least, they can certainly slow the administration's roll. David Dayen, always a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
David Dayen is the author of Chain of Title: How Three Ordinary Americans Uncovered Wall Street's Great Foreclosure Fraud. Just ahead, Trump's regulatory plans don't quite add up. We'll talk to Amit Narang from Public Citizen. And if you missed any part of this show, don't forget, become a member of the podcast. Just head over to rofpodcast.com to sign up now. It's your support that keeps this show on the air, and we need it, folks. I'm Sam Seder. You're listening to Ring of Fire Radio.